Hey, what's up? I'm back with a new review for Resident Evil Village. But before I get into that, I'd quickly like to give my thoughts on another game in the series I intended to do a review for, but never ended up doing the full video for. So, let me get this out of the way. I loved the Resident Evil 2 remake so much, I was massively hyped for Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remake. Sadly, the game didn't pan out the same way I thought it would. Now, I point this out not only because I didn't make the video, but because my feelings for the game say a lot about the direction I feel Capcom is trying to take the series, and what my opinions are on that.
Hey! Fuckface!
Long story short, I feel Resident Evil 3 failed to deliver on any of the best parts of the Resident Evil 2 remake. The game was far more linear, more action focused, and most importantly, I feel they failed to make Nemesis an imposing figure anywhere near on the level of Mr. X. I'll elaborate later on how I feel this direction will affect the series as a whole going down the road. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to the main dish, Resident Evil Village. Let's go! Resident Evil Village starts catching us up with the protagonists of Resident Evil 7. Turns out that tragedy really brings a couple together, as they have made a new addition to the family, their daughter, Rosemary. In this game, we are once again firmly planted into Ethan's nondescript shoes, who, despite leaving the Bayous and the Baker family behind, finds creative new ways to be on the receiving end of numerous injuries, solidifying him as a title holder for the main character who has received the most ass whoopings in series history so far. Of course, Ethan doesn't voluntarily sign up to make himself a pincushion. Ethan is living his best life in witness protection, trying his best to put any thoughts of mold-infested rednecks behind him, only to have his new life abruptly shattered
NANI?
by none other than resident boulder puncher, Chris Redfield.
Sorry, Ethan. No!
Who shows up out of nowhere, totally unprompted. He then murders his wife, steals his child, and then decides to cart him off to God knows where. Well, damn. That's one way to open the game. During transport, Ethan's truck is attacked, and he's the only survivor. Ethan begins his blind search around the countryside for any hint as where his daughter may be. He stumbles upon a small village under looming shadow of a massive castle. With absolutely no other leads, he decides it's better than nothing and heads into the village. Resident Evil Village takes place in first person, much like Resident Evil 7. It's very effective at pulling you into the game and has great opportunity for scares that I find the game uses to great effect at some moments. While I personally prefer the third-person perspective of the other games, I do feel that Resident Evil Village had no other choice than to go first-person with this, as the design choices all revolve around it and I think they use it to great effect. What I would like to see in the future is a VR port of this game. Now I think that would be a great way to revisit this title. This sleepy Romanian village Ethan has found himself in has obviously seen better days. There's absolutely no pretense that everything is normal for even a moment. This village looks like a biblical storm hit it with all the gore and broke down machinery blocking every path you come across. I really love this area, it's dripping with atmosphere. The tour is cut short not long after entering by a scared villager who almost blows a hole in Ethan's head. Visibly distraught, the man gives us a pistol to defend ourselves. But from what? Oh. Maybe that. Man, I don't think these building shacks are up to code. Oh no. Definitely not up to code. I don't think that's proper insulation. This is where we find what seems to be the entire population of the village underneath the floorboards. This is also where we get our first painful glimpse of the Lycans. This is the group of monsters that has been terrorizing this village, and they don't take long reminding Ethan that he has a bad habit of losing body parts. Unlike the molded in Resident Evil 7, the Lycans are much more agile and tend to prefer working in groups, overwhelming and flanking Ethan at every opportunity. When you aim, they'll attempt to dodge your crosshairs much like the Ganados in Resident Evil 4. We take out this lone Lycan, but soon find ourselves besieged in a hopeless situation with no escape in sight. If this scenario feels familiar at all, it is. Resident Evil makes no effort to hide what it really wants to be. Resident Evil 4. Many scenarios in this game mirror Leon's Spanish babysitting adventure, almost painfully so. This will not be the first or last time that any Resident Evil veteran will notice the wholesale recycling of ideas, but in first person. While the siege scene isn't the most original idea, it works in setting the tone in the scene that Ethan finds himself in. Much like the scene in Resident Evil 4, we're given a bit of a trial by fire tutorial where Ethan runs around the village avoiding as many monsters as possible until finally being cornered. At the very last second, everyone is called off and Ethan is left totally fine. The only thing we're missing is a classic one-liner to finish the scene off. We don't get one of those this time.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
With the Lycan horde barely out of sight, Ethan sees an old woman in the distance. And this is where I can first note that I think Ethan is the most dense and clueless character I've ever seen.
Chris? What the hell? Who is? What the hell was that? Dead body? What the fuck was that? What the fuck are they doing here? What are you talking about? Wait, where's my gun?
I get that he is a seasoned veteran of fighting monsters, so understandably, he's a bit numb to the fact that he's not just moments ago attacked by werewolves. I find the only time I found it acceptable to have a returning character as the main protagonist is Isaac Clarke in Dead Space. The first game, it's all brand new, he's suitably freaked the hell out about everything. The second game, he's a little more experienced, but he still doesn't seem like too much of a badass.
Isaac, no! This is a really bad idea.
Well, stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
In the third game, well, we don't talk about Dead Space 3. If you're gonna have a returning character, personally I think it's best to have them in a supporting role and give us a new character to experience the game with. That lets us have that contact high of fear when this character is experiencing all these extremely scary things for the first time. Coming back to Ethan to perfectly illustrate my point, with the 1,000-mile stare of a war veteran, Ethan tells this old woman that he found that it's not safe outside, like he's trying to get a merit badge for helping her cross the road. The old lady is quick to let us know that she's well aware of the situation in the village, and even knows about his missing daughter, strangely enough. The old crone lets us know that it was Mother Miranda who brought his daughter to the village. Mother Miranda appears to be the de facto leader and head of the religion in the village. The villagers speak of her like she's a fictional character, but she is very, very much real.
Stop! Mother Miranda! Hey!
Now knowing that his daughter is in the village, Ethan leaves the crone to her ramblings and begins to explore the village further. Ethan stumbles upon two more survivors, Elena and her injured father. We assist them in seeking refuge in a nearby homestead populated by several other survivors. We don't learn much here other than the Lycan horde hit the village hard and fast, killing most, if not all, the villagers that are not present in the room. If by this point you haven't figured it out, surprise! Majority of the Lycans are actually the villagers themselves. Much like the legend they're based off of, surviving a Lycan attack doesn't usually bode well for those around you.
What are you doing?
Leonardo, what's wrong? Are you okay?
Elena's father succumbs to his infection and attacks everyone else in the house. Now I sure hope you didn't like any of the characters they just introduced, because guess what? They're all dead. Every single one of them.
Reach for me!
Everything I touch dies!
Having learned nothing at the house, Ethan decides that he should head to the castle on nothing more than a hunch that it's where his daughter is being kept. Fair enough. Not like we were just in a building full of characters that could have given him anything to go off of.
Put a sock in it, Roxana!
That's enough!
Anyways, just before we can enter the castle properly, Ethan is ambushed and ensnared by who I can only assume is Magneto himself.
It's a long way from here. You'd better get some gas.
Nobody tells me what to do. Besides, fuel is for lesser men. My vehicle needs no gas.
You're putting me on. Every car needs gas.
You witless young fool.
Ethan is then drug off to meet this game's rogues gallery, consisting of the village's leaders. Now, from what I can tell, each of the 4 house leaders represents a classic movie monster. First and foremost, we have the giant lady who set the internet on fire, Lady Demetrice. Towering over all, she is for all intents and purposes a vampire. Next up, the creepy doll belongs to Lady Beneviento. I believe she represents ghosts, and uses haunted dolls to interact with everyone around her. Moreau is a grotesque figure representing what I can only imagine as a merman. And lastly, we have Heisenberg. He seems to closely represent Dr. Frankenstein with his electricity-flavored powers and penchant for building monsters. Now, Mother Miranda herself doesn't appear to represent any specific classic monster, but she definitely does give off that Jonestown cult leader personality. Ethan wakes up to the 5 deliberating on who gets to kill him, with Heisenberg eventually winning out in the end, and decides to subject Ethan to a trap-laden gauntlet. Of course, things don't go his way, and we escape by the skin of our teeth. Having escaped death once more, Ethan is now free to explore once again, with the 4 lords now assuming his death. Once we get back to the castle, we're introduced to the only real recurring character that Ethan has any back and forth with, the surprisingly well-fed Duke. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Resident Evil 8 really wants to be Resident Evil 4.
Something that might interest you.
The Duke fills the exact same role that the merchant in Resident Evil 4 did, being a hub for us to sell various treasures we find on our way, purchase new weapons, and upgrade those weapons. Oddly enough, the Duke isn't only a merchant, he's actually a pretty pivotal character in the game's overall story. The Duke will constantly dole out advice that Ethan would have no other way of knowing, and continually prod you along the correct path at just the right moments. His motives remain unclear throughout the game, and are never really fully explored. He does seem to have history with the villagers and the 4 lords, as he's mentioned on several occasions to have done business with them. It's a bit of a shame that he doesn't get more of a role in the story. It seems to be this really kind of gray middle ground where he's there but not there. Now, I didn't mind the Duke's character. He was fun enough to have around, but I feel he usurped the role that any other possible surviving villager could have played in assisting Ethan on his quest. If they didn't want to give the Duke a more active role in the game, they should have got rid of him altogether. I find his constant appearances tend to break the tension far too often, and as much as I enjoy the character, everything he does could have been done better throughout the actual gameplay itself. Clues on where to go for your next area should have been given through gameplay or through interactions with other characters in the game. Upgrades could have been easily done through a menu. There's no need to have a merchant just to do it. Once we're done shopping with the Duke, we enter the castle proper. Lady Demetrice's castle is what I can only describe as the most classic Resident Evil you get in this game. You spend the majority of your time in this castle avoiding the Lord of the Manor herself, while exploring the area, finding keys to open up more doors, and find notes and, hints on how to escape this castle, trying to find your daughter while you're at it. Unfortunately for Ethan, soon after he begins his exploration of the castle, he is captured by Lady Demetrice's 3 daughters. Ethan once again gets to showcase his special talent of being captured and strung up. Ethan also gives us another display of his inhuman durability as he rips his hands out of the hooks as he begins to explore the castle once again. We learn that the lords of the village have historically been less than kind to their subjects, as Demetrice appears to have been experimenting on the villagers and using them as a source of food and winemaking for some time. Her 3 daughters being the fruit of her experiments, her daughters actually turn out not to be human at all, but a self-aware swarm of insects who rely on blood sustenance to survive, much like their mother. Not long after escaping, Ethan is once again cornered by one of Demetrice's daughters, and is forced into a fight. Unfortunately, we can't do any damage to her as she just disperses into a swarm of insects, so our only option is to flee. Thankfully, at the end of our path, we find that breaking the windows reveals their true fatal weakness, and considering where they live, it's a pretty bad one. The 3 daughters can't cope with the freezing temperatures outside the castle walls, and are hence bound to the castle itself, never able to leave themselves. Ethan is surprisingly able to use this new information to dispatch the 3 sisters one by one. Mother, however, doesn't share the same weakness to the cold, and it turns out she's not a big fan of us cutting her bloodline short. Nothing a little bit of healing juice can't fix, right? I mean, nothing strange about Ethan being able to still do that, right? Hell, even his jacket gets healed. Once we've disposed of Demetrius' 3 daughters, we have all the keys to get to the final area of the castle. Once we get there, we reach a mausoleum that contains a corpse with a dagger in it. Unfortunately, we're cornered, and Demetrius catches up with us. Ethan uses the new dagger he found to stab her. Fortunately for him, it was coated in a poison that forces Demetrius to transform into a more monstrous form. Once Ethan bests her in combat, the Demetrius bloodline is finally closed, as she crystallizes and breathes her last. Upon leaving, Ethan obtains a mysterious flask, thinks nothing of it, and heads back to the village. Upon exiting the castle, the Drook drops some knowledge to Ethan about the flask he just picked up. Turns out, shortly after being kidnapped, Rose was somehow split into 4 separate vials, with each piece being given to one of the 4 lords. It's here we clearly see how the game's going to play out, with 4 acts, 1 for each vial, with a big finale at the end. It's now Ethan's mission to take down the lords in turn, to get the pieces of his daughter back, and somehow put her back together. The Duke just hand waves this. It's not really explaining the situation other than pointing us back to the village. We have a few new routes to explore in the village, and obtain some more optional items. So after exploring the village for a little bit more, we get a key and we're off to see the next lord, Lady Beneviento, the reclusive doll maker. Personally, I think the dollhouse has to be my favorite part of the game. The game hits incredible highs when it's in this area, and it really hammers home on the horror aspect of this survival horror experience. Resident Evil Village has a bit of a tendency, much like Resident Evil 4, to lean a little too heavy on the action side, and I can definitely see where they're starting to slowly crank that dial further and further. Hopefully they don't get as crazy as Resident Evil 6. Now, while I don't have the strongest computer and I had a couple frame rate issues with this game, I'm sure you see this in the recordings, this area was the first time I really stopped and looked around at the scenery. The Resident Evil engine is really good. I can only imagine what this looks like on a really good system. Even the area leading up to the dollhouse is great. It's got this really mist-shrouded vibe. Definitely gives off a lot of Silent Hill vibes. And so after taking in the sights, we get up to the dollhouse, and everything seems normal. Almost too normal, considering the state of the rest of the village. Even the inside of the house is completely normal. The upper floors are completely droll and bare of anything. No enemies, no items. The only place we can go is to the basement. And yeah, we gotta go to the basement. Let's go.
I've been waiting for so long. I'd make a much better daughter than Rose. Please, won't you stay with me forever?
What?
That's the latest. As you can see behind me, everything is now fine. Ignore the smoke, that's just from the recent explosion, because, as I say, everything is fine now.
Not long after entering the basement, Ethan finds that he's been stripped of all his items. And this gives us a key on how this chapter is going to play out. There's not going to be a whole lot of combat going on here. The first thing we find in the basement is a doll of Mia, even wrapped up in bandages exactly where Mia was shot.
Sorry, Ethan.
Personally, I thought this was going to play more story significance later on, but unfortunately that payout didn't turn off. It just seems that Lady Beneviento was making a Mia doll for no reason other than to screw with Ethan. Upon further examination, we can take the Mia doll apart. This nets us several items. We receive a key, a film reel, and a few hints to a puzzle that we'll need later down the road. Upon further exploring the area, I noticed that some of these lockers are just big enough for Ethan to fit in. Huh. Oh well. I'm not going to worry about that. Personally, I'd like to know how Capcom split their team up on how they made the chapters of this game. The strongest parts of this game are Lady Demetrius' castle and Lady Beneviento's mansion. Considering how each chapter in this game plays in a very different manner, Lady Demetrius' castle was very classic Resident Evil. Lady Beneviento's mansion here is extremely, I mean extremely reminiscent of Silent Hill. It's almost like someone at Capcom was as mad about PT being cancelled as I was.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
I mean, come on, Konami. Sell the goddamn rights to Silent Hill to somebody. It doesn't have to be Capcom, doesn't have to be Kojima, but give it to someone who's gonna give us a real horror game. Come on. You know you want to. I mean, you don't even have to do anything, just sell it and stay far, far, far away from it. So, after we solve a couple of puzzles, we go down a creepy well from the ring. At the bottom of the well, we find a key for the breaker box. Now, we need this key as the elevator we went down with isn't functioning. So now that we got the key, it's time to head back to the breaker box and see what's going on there. You don't think anything bad's gonna happen, right guys? Shit. As soon as the lights went off and the radio started screaming at me, I knew shit was about to get real. I can't stress enough about how much I love this whole scene. Everything about it's great. The first thing I honestly noticed once the lights went out is that there was this cord on the ground. This bloody cord on the ground. And that the Mia doll was nowhere to be seen. So I honestly thought that the doll had got up and came back to life and was going to chase you around, but the reality of the situation was much, much worse. As soon as you head down the hallway, the first thing you hear, the next thing you see, is the baby. If you even get that far. Honestly, when I first encountered the thing, I turned around before I even knew what the hell it was, because I was just losing my mind. And it was at this moment that I realized I don't have a gun, I don't have any items, the only thing I can do is run. So run I did. I went immediately to that closet I found earlier. Thankfully you're safe in there, but it's still an extremely unsettling sight. Our goal is obviously to not get caught. If you get caught, well, it's game over. There's only one bad thing I can say about this section of the game. It is just unfortunately over way too soon. I would have loved to have a few more areas to explore while this thing is chasing me, or other things. I really hope the guys who made this section of the game go on to do great things. So, with Konami being Konami, I can't really expect a Silent Hill game to come out anytime soon. I think Capcom is in a really unique position here. Resident Evil has such an installed fan base, and I guarantee if you released a really good, solid, just horror game, people would buy it. I'd buy it immediately. I wouldn't stop screaming from the rooftops about it. Come on, Capcom. Less boulder punching, more this baby thing. Now, while I doubt Capcom's gonna go in this direction, I really hope this reinvigorated a bunch of indie developers. Seriously, my hat's off to whoever made this section of the game. It is hands down the best, and I sure hope that a lot of other people realize that. Once we escape the giant baby, we head back up to the main floor of the house. Things have definitely changed since we were last down there. There's doll parts everywhere, and just hundreds of dolls staring at you. And before we can escape the house, we're accosted by Lady Beneviento with Angie, and we're forced to chase her down throughout the house. She hides in several areas of the house, and all we have to do is find her and stab her 3 times.
Fucking monster!
Thankfully, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to find Angie. The house is really small, and there's not a whole lot of places for her to hide. So with Lady Beneviento dead, we claim our prize, and we head off to the next lord, Fishman himself, Moreau. So, I hate to say, from here on out, the game kind of goes downhill for me.
caught myself a big one.
Move this man!
The first 2 chapters of the game were great. They really set up a survival horror atmosphere. The latter 2 chapters and the finale really drag off into Resident Evil 5 and 6 territory in my opinion, where they're a little too much flash with no substance. And we first see this with Salvatore Moreau. He's a bumbling idiot who undermines himself at every turn. It's almost a comedy act. He reminds me a lot of Ramon Salazar, the comedic relief villain in Resident Evil 4. Not only do we enter his domain with next to no resistance, he's too busy watching TV to guard the flask that he's been tasked to protect. So, never to squander an easy opportunity, Ethan takes the flask and taunts Moreau.
I'll just be taking this.
Unfortunately for Ethan, Salvatore Moreau isn't just a bumbling idiot. He has control over all the slimy growths in the area and blocks our way out of the mines. He then lures us to his ideal territory, the flooded reservoir. In yet another nod to Resident Evil 4, Moreau himself turns into a giant catfish. We spend the entirety of this area wandering around trying not to get killed by him, but the area itself is so context sensitive, it's almost like playing an interactive movie. There's not a whole lot you can do here to mess up, and there's not even any enemies to fight really along the way. Now, I'll admit in concept, I think they could have pulled Moreau's area off really well, but unfortunately, they kind of dropped the ball. In concept, Moreau is supposed to chase you around this basin while you attempt to drain the water using the sluice gate. You have to power up some windmills that are around the area, which requires you to drop platforms into the water so you can quickly cross before Moreau can attack and kill you. Unfortunately, aside from these few crossing areas, all he does is swim menacingly around in a pattern. He can't even attack you from the water, he just kind of swims around waiting for you to get within reach. I think this might have been better pulled off if they had Ethan in the boat more and, trying to dodge Moreau that way if they wanted to have a more action-oriented scene that was still tense. But as it is, it's way too easy to get around him. I didn't even have any issues getting through this area. Heck, they could have even thrown a few enemies in to keep pressure on you while you're trying to move forward. It turns out Chris has been in the village the entire time monitoring the situation. Understandably still upset, Ethan starts to get into it with Chris, before they're interrupted by Moreau and are once again split up.
You stay out of our business, Ethan.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What business?
Once we drain the basin, we're faced with a decent boss fight with Moreau. I kind of like this boss fight. It was interesting mechanics wise. You had to hide in certain areas, had to avoid them in others. Overall, as far as boss fights in this series go, I'm gonna actually say this was probably the best, quote unquote, boss fight. And so, we take down the heel of the group, and we move on to the final lord, Heisenberg.
Who's that?
Oh, come on. We just met a while back, not that it really matters.
You witless young fool.
But before we can actually get to Heisenberg, he contacts us first with a proposition and invites us to his factory. It turns out Ethan's daughter Rose has an undescribed power that Heisenberg wishes to harness to usurp Mother Miranda and escape his bonds. Ethan, the ever-dense protagonist, refuses Heisenberg's assistance and is then tossed deep into Heisenberg's factory to die.
Last chance. You don't have to find out what's in that hole.
I'll take my chances.
You're futile.
The place is a hell of a lot bigger on the inside than it looks. The whole place is a giant factory Heisenberg has been used to make his metal army that he hopes will be able to take Mother Miranda down. Now, I can get over how impossibly large the factory is. What I can't understand is how many goddamn people are in this village. This guy's got an entire assembly line of these monsters. The village sure didn't look like it had this many people, so not really sure where he's getting them. Now, if you guys have watched my other videos, you'll probably know that factories aren't my favorite. They're very drab and nondescript, and this one is no exception. The only saving grace of this area are the mechanized enemies, which are a really neat twist on the whole idea. Now, while these mechanized enemies are really cool in concept, I feel in execution they're just big, dumb bullet sponges. They don't really have a lot of variation in what they do, and they can be baited very easily. And for being as tough as they are, they're used way too often to pad this overlong experience of the factory. Now, I'm going to save you from having to see the entire playthrough of the factory because it takes forever. It's one of the longest chapters in the game, and to be honest, it's the weakest and most boring. It really killed the experience for me. So we make the long trek through the factory just to get to the top, only to be immediately thrown back to the bottom again.
Don't come back here!
Now, oddly enough, once we get to the bottom of the factory again,
I told you to leave it alone, Ethan!
Chris is here. No rhyme, no reason. He's just here when he needs to be. Oddly less confrontational this time, Chris fully explains the situation to Ethan, that he didn't actually murder his wife. Huh.
So that was a fucking lie.
It turns out Mother Miranda has the power to shapeshift and has taken Mia's place in Ethan's life at some undetermined point in time. Chris was wise to her plan to kidnap Rose and attempted to cut her plan short by shooting her in the head. So, it seems like this whole thing could have been a hell of a lot easier if Chris, explained anything to Ethan.
No.
I mean, Ethan's not my favorite.
What are you talking about?
But he survived the Baker household, so it's not like he wouldn't understand the whole situation with, shape-shifting monsters and your daughter has supernatural powers that can't be controlled. After the fact, why not explain? Like, go ahead, shoot his wife in front of him, traumatize the guy. However, it's explained that Chris believes Ethan is nothing more than a civilian and wants to keep him and his wife out of it. I'm not sure where along that line, murdering what he believes is his wife, kidnapping his daughter, would not drag him into this. God damn it, Chris. And you know what? Sure, Ethan has absolutely no reason to believe him, but he does. And then he puts on his badass face.
Damn straight we will. And when I find Miranda, she's a dead woman.
Now that Chris is done being a giant exposition dump, he hands us a giant mech MacGuffin that we use to battle Heisenberg in an over-the-top battle. Again, it's not a bad fight, but it's got the same issue that Moreau's entire chapter had, where it's more style over substance. There's not a whole lot going on in this battle other than spectacle. And I mean, it's cool, but...
Please clap.
That's all it is. It's not engaging. And I really want these boss fights to be more engaging and thought-provoking than just spam the gun. Against all odds, Ethan defeats Heisenberg, immediately meeting with Mother Miranda. Turns out that Mother Miranda has been using Ethan, surprise surprise, to quell Heisenberg's rebellion. Originally wanting to recruit Ethan as a general in her army of sorts, but has decided she doesn't need us anymore, pulls an Indiana Jones, and rips Ethan's heart out. And so surprisingly, Ethan's dead. And with him dies any pretense this game had of being a horror game. Because guess what, boys? It's Boulder Puncher o'clock! Chris! We take over as Chris, and things start to come to a head as Chris and his action squad blast into the village and try to stop Miranda and save Rose. This whole section is really uninspired and boring as you run around as Chris with next to unlimited ammo as you romp through the village mowing down foes. Now, it's almost immediately that they start throwing around the term Megamycete all over the place.
The Megamycete.
Mutamycete. The Mutamycete. Megamycete.
Megamycete! It's the Megamycete.
Now, this is just shorthand for the source core of the mold, and if you destroy it, you destroy all the mold in the area. Just like Evelyn in the Baker residence. Once Chris plants what seems to be the smallest nuke in the world into the Megamycete, we actually find Mia alive and well. Chris explains to Mia that Ethan is dead. Mia's not so sure about that.
I tried to keep this a secret, but... You don't understand how special he is.
Are you sure about that?
Fortunately, we take back over as Ethan. Unfortunately, it's in a dream sequence. And of all people we could meet in our dream, it's Granny. I mean, Evelyn.
You're so dumb.
Evelyn confirms that being able to reattach your limbs after they've been sliced off is not normal human behavior. Ethan was infected with the mold back at the Baker family, and technically, he never really made it out alive. With the mold being the only thing keeping Ethan technically alive, this revelation lets him get back on his feet, and thankfully, we're out of Chris's shoes and back into Ethan's. It turns out when we wake up, the Duke has been carting Ethan's corpse around, hopefully not to eat us. Thankfully, that's not the case, and it turns out the Duke is actually taking Ethan to Miranda before he even knows to ask. Again, I'm not really a big fan of how the Duke just happens to know everything and get us where we need to be, with no real motivation or, explanation of how he knows these things. He truly is the Duke Ex Machina of the game. And the Duke drops Ethan off, and we're funneled into a climactic final fight. The less said about this fight, the better. It's pretty standard multi-phase fight, and considering that some of the other boss fights were more interesting, I'm surprised that this one was so boring. So, if you're like me, throughout the game you've been hoarding away all your better ammo, it's time to unload it now. So, once we dispose of Mother Miranda, she crumbles away like all the other lords, revealing Rose was still inside her the whole time. Luckily, none of those bullets hit her, I guess. Due to the fungus's hive mind, it appears that killing Miranda doesn't mean she's gone for good. So we pack up Rose and take off. Ethan himself is looking worse for wear. At this point, he's slowly crumbling to nothing. It would appear that his regenerative properties have been stretched to their upper limit. I mean, considering all the punishment this guy's been through, I can see there being a somewhat of an upper limit of his powers. So Ethan meets up with Chris and decides to make one last stand that honestly he didn't really have to make. They had the detonator and it was obviously okay to use from further away. But I mean, if you're gonna die, may as well go out with a bang, right? This is the end of the line for Ethan, but not for his daughter it would seem.
Tell me what's going on. Where?
First, cool.
Rose has more than likely inherited the ability to control the mold of some sort, much like Evelyn, and as such she's being kept under surveillance by the government. Not really a fan of the hook at the end, as it's only coming back to my main criticism of the game is that they're slowly easing their way back into the same pattern they did with Resident Evil 5 and 6. The game does not need to go into this bombastic action set piece area. Leave that to the action games. Keep the horror game a horror game, guys. Dead Space could have giant impressive set pieces and still be scary as fuck. Let's do that. So, here are my thoughts on the action focus of the latter half of this game.
Well, stick around. I'm full of bad ideas.
It's painfully obvious that Capcom desperately wants to capture that mass appeal they had with Resident Evil 4, where both horror fans and action fans piled onto the game. Resident Evil 4 itself was lightning in a bottle. I don't think they can capture that again, and I understand that action games sell better, but I really wish they would leave the horror game to be a horror game with some action-y elements, I guess. What worries me though, is that they've done this before, and it did not end well for the series, let's say. Capcom's not the only developer who had a hit horror franchise that as they keep reiterating on it, the sales just seem to keep getting lower and lower and lower. It's unfortunate that AAA developers can't seem to justify the sales for a big horror game like this. But, I mean, if you can't justify the sales for a big horror game like this, tune the development down a little, keep the budget under control, don't worry so much about marketing. Let the fans market these kind of games. We're good at it. We're really good at it. As much as I'm not a big fan of action in my horror games, I feel that a delicate balance can create a really good game like Resident Evil 4. I just don't have faith that Capcom knows what they're doing. If Resident Evil 3 was a better remake, I'd be a lot more optimistic on Resident Evil 4 remake and whatever they're gonna plan for Resident Evil 8. I honestly don't have high hopes for either game, but I will be interested to see where they turn out. Maybe I just need to accept that horror games are going to be very rare in the AAA game space. And I really like the new ideas I see bouncing around in the horror space with the indie developers. I'd really like to see some of the AAA developers pick these little studios up and uplift them, give them maybe a AA budget, and see what they can do with a little bit more money, but the same artistic control. I think there's a really good balance to be found where indie games can prove themselves and larger publishers can come pick these guys up and, let them show their stuff. In the end though, I really want there to be a place in the market for big budget horror games, as I love them when they're done well. Resident Evil 2 Remake is still my favorite game of all time. It's amazing, it's perfect. I want to see more like that. God damn it, Konami. I want Silent Hills. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with Resident Evil 8. While it may not be an utter masterpiece like Resident Evil 2 Remake was, I appreciate the things they tried, and I really love some of the unique ideas it had. Now, I know my review's a little late to the party, so I already see the online sentiment where most people really enjoyed the first two parts much like I did. Hopefully Capcom can really lean into the horror elements for the next game. One thing I will note that I'm enjoying is the return of the Mercenaries mode. I've only put a little bit of time in it, but it seems really fun. And one other funny thing I'm going to note though is, along with Resident Evil 8, Capcom planned to release a multiplayer aspect as well. Resident Evil Verse, or Reverse. I have not, and I will not play this. But considering that it's already been delayed, I'll be surprised if they even bother releasing it at this point. I think the financials and fan sentiment have been pretty clear that nobody wants this, and it's dead on arrival. Capcom, listen to me. You want to make a multiplayer Resident Evil experience work? You did already. Remake the Outbreak series. Do it, you cowards! I want to thank anyone who's listened to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.
Hello?
Jill, are you okay?
Brad, is that you?
Listen, you gotta get out of there.
What are you talking about?
I don't have time to explain. You gotta get out of there right now.
All right, let me grab my...
It's goofy time.
What the hell is that thing?